On a sticky Mother's Day afternoon, my phone chimed with a message from my only daughter that pierced me deeper than any labor pain. "You don't deserve love, not from me, not from anybody," it read, and my hand trembled so hard I almost dropped my coffee. I didn't text back because my tongue felt glued to the roof of my mouth and my mind spun through decades of lullabies and late-night homework, while a thunderhead settled over the skyline outside my Queens apartment. Before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to subscribe so that you're the first to listen to these new stories as I post them here on the channel, and click the like button to show other moms with grown-up kids that we're all in this together. That evening, as Rachel brushed past the marble concierge desk of their glossy penthouse lobby with her designer tote swinging, the doorman handed her a thick envelope with her name in my handwriting. And before she finished the first paragraph, her face drained of color. What could a 70-year-old widow write that would make her own daughter stop mid-step in a place she thought she owned? And why would she suddenly wonder if the marble under her high heels still belonged to her? To answer that, I have to take you back to the chipped kitchen table where my life unraveled and then rewove itself. One bank statement, one conversation, and one love withdrawn at a time. I'm Sandra, 68, a retired bookkeeper who knows a ledger line from a lie, yet I never imagined that my own child would see my generosity as an unlimited line of credit she could overdraft with no apology. My husband, God rest him, passed when Rachel was in college, and every penny I scrimped, folding sheets at the laundromat and balancing accounts at the local charter school, went into keeping her in sneakers and a Toyota Camry that I still drove long after she married. We lived in the same Queens neighborhood my grandparents settled in, near a Safeway where the cashiers knew my name, and a CVS that felt like an extension of my medicine cabinet, the kind of place where small kindnesses add up and your business is everyone's business. Rachel met Daniel in Manhattan, a hedge fund wunderkind with slicked back hair and a penchant for making mountains out of his own molehills, and molehills out of my sacrifices. When they married, he insisted on a luxury condo in Midtown with sweeping city views, financed with his bonus and my good credit, because he convinced Rachel that I needed a safer building and that co-ownership was just a formality since families share everything, don't they? In the beginning, I believed him, flattered that my son-in-law wanted me close, charmed by the lobby's glossy floors and the scent of lemon oil, and eager to help watch my grandson David while they climbed career ladders I had never been allowed to touch. For 5 years, that arrangement worked, mostly because I bit my tongue while they redecorated with mid-century everything, rolled their eyes at my crocheted throws, and asked me to sign for packages from fancy retailers like Michael's and Target that I couldn't imagine affording even on sale. I'd cook Campbell's soup for David when he refused their farm-to-table kale and wipe Tylenol syrup off his chin when fever spikes kept him home from pre-K. And in those small moments, I convinced myself this sacrifice made me indispensable. Every weekday at 7 a.m., I laced up my walking shoes, took the elevator 6 floors to their apartment, and watched their little boy's eyes flutter open while the city still yawned. All while Rachel rattled off instructions as if I were a hired nanny instead of her mother. When she'd toss her keys on the counter and say, "Pick up David's costume from Michael's for his recital," I'd nod and fold the request into my own errands, sometimes stopping at 7-Eleven for a coffee refill, because saving them money cost me time and energy I never billed. On paper, our arrangement looked fair, my name on a deed, their name on my calendar. But I kept noticing little slights like Daniel borrowing my AAA card to get his flat tire fixed and not returning it for weeks, or Rachel offering my spare bedroom to her friends without asking me first. One December, when a pipe burst in my own portion of the condo, I went downstairs to the building's maintenance office only to find Daniel had told the superintendent I wasn't authorized to request repairs because he was primary owner. And I stood in the hallway holding my dripping bucket, feeling invisible. Instead of confronting him right then, I took a deep breath that smelled faintly of bleach and lemon from the building's janitorial closet, and reminded myself that raising Rachel had taught me patience in spades until the deck of their demands finally toppled. The tipping point arrived disguised as a simple request. Rachel asked me to co-sign on a second mortgage so Daniel could invest in a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity at his hedge fund. And when I balked, she accused me of not supporting her dreams. I told her politely that I wasn't comfortable risking my retirement nest egg, that I lived modestly on my Social Security checks and a small annuity from Edward Jones, and that I did not want to be responsible if his gamble failed. She rolled her eyes and said, "You owe us, after everything we've done for you," as if letting me sleep in a spare bedroom I partly owned counted as charity. And Daniel nodded like a foreman, urging on a reluctant laborer. Later that week, a large check I deposited from selling my grandmother's china took longer to clear than usual, and the bank app only released $200 of it even after 2 business days. Worried, I took the bus to the Chase branch on Queens Boulevard, and the teller kindly explained that federal rules allow banks to hold the remainder of a large deposit beyond $200 if there's suspicion it may not clear, if the account is new, or if the deposit exceeds $5,000. She said it was standard and would release soon, but her comment about suspicious deposits planted a seed. Had Rachel or Daniel been using my accounts in ways that would trigger holds? That evening, I pored over my statements, reading them like old love letters gone sour, and I noticed a series of withdrawals I hadn't authorized, including wire transfers to an account with Daniel's name on it, and charges from luxury boutiques I'd never set foot in. My heart hammered like the dryer at the laundromat when you forget to clean the lint trap, and I felt my cheeks heat as I realized my own daughter had been siphoning money from my savings while telling me we were family. A flurry of emotions, shame for not catching it sooner, betrayal from the very person I birthed, and anger that they would use David as a bargaining chip, collided as I dialed their number with my hands shaking. Rachel answered breathless, as if she'd been running, and before I could even ask about the transfers, she launched into a request that I pick up David early from preschool because her yoga class had run late. Instead of lashing out, I swallowed my hurt, said I needed to speak in person about something serious, and hung up, already pulling an old micro-cassette recorder from my bottom desk drawer and checking the batteries because of something I remembered hearing about consent laws. A neighbor who worked as a legal secretary once told me that our state is a one-party consent state, which means you can record a conversation as long as you're part of it. If you secretly tape people when you're not in the conversation, it becomes a felony that can carry up to 4 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. So I planned to stay on the line and let my recorder catch every word. When Rachel and Daniel came over, I set the recorder inside a coffee mug on the table and pressed record, then asked them about the wire transfers and my name on that second mortgage application. They exchanged a quick glance, the kind married couples share when their story has been rehearsed, and Daniel smiled thinly as he said, "I must have misread the statements and that there was no second mortgage, only a refinancing to get a better rate." Rachel chimed in with honeyed condescension, telling me I was getting older and maybe my memory wasn't as sharp, and something snapped inside me as I realized they were gaslighting me in my own home. I asked them to show me the papers, and after some hemming and hawing, Daniel pulled a folder from his leather briefcase and slid it toward me. Their signatures were there, and so was mine, except I knew I had never held that pen. The signature looked like mine if you squinted, the loops of the S forced and heavy, and while my stomach lurched at the forgery, my mind clicked into place like a bank teller counting cash. I had proof. I thanked them calmly, slipped the folder into my tote bag, and excused myself to use the bathroom, where I sat on the closed toilet seat, breathing through a silent panic, one hand over my mouth to stifle a sob. With the recorder still rolling on the table, Rachel said to Daniel, "She'll cave once David begs to see us. She won't risk losing him." And his response, "That old woman will sign anything if we push the right buttons." burned into my memory. My hand shook so hard I nearly dropped my cell phone, but the pain of hearing their strategy also crystallized my path. I wouldn't let them weaponize my grandson's love against me. After they left, I poured myself a cup of Folgers coffee, sat by the window watching traffic smear taillights along Queens Boulevard like red lipstick on a napkin, and replayed the recording until my resolve hardened. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about dignity, boundaries, and teaching my daughter that her choices had consequences, just like a check that bounces when you overdraw. First, I had to secure my finances, so I scheduled an appointment with an advisor at Fidelity to move a portion of my savings into a separate account Daniel couldn't access, and I opened a secondary checking account at Capital One with two-factor authentication. The advisor reminded me to monitor my accounts daily and set up text alerts for any withdrawals over $50. A simple safeguard that felt like locking my doors at night in a neighborhood that had suddenly gone from safe to suspect. Next, I visited the county clerk's office to verify the deed on the penthouse, shuffling past rows of worn wooden benches and filing cabinets to a clerk who smelled of peppermint and overripe paper. She looked over her reading glasses and confirmed that my name remained on the title alongside theirs, a tiny consolation that proved I still legally owned part of the home I vacuumed every Thursday. When I asked what it would take to change the ownership structure, she said, "Deed changes require recording with the county and often take a few weeks with a small recording fee, but no transfer tax if you're not exchanging money." A timeline that mattered for my plan. Armed with that information and the recording of their admission, I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer who specialized in real estate disputes. Her office smelled of leather and lemon oil, and there was a row of framed diplomas behind her desk that radiated competence. After listening to my story and reviewing the forged signature, she suggested filing a partition action, a legal mechanism that forces co-owners to sell the property and divide the proceeds when they can't agree, and she nodded when I asked if that meant Daniel would have to leave. She cautioned me that these cases can drag on, that Daniel's lawyers would try every trick, and that I needed to keep my evidence airtight and my emotions in check, especially since my grandson's custody was not directly at issue, but would always be an undertone. I left her office with a retainer agreement tucked in my purse and a new sense of agency in my chest, as if I had replaced the anger with action. And I decided to keep living with them for now to gather more observations, much like my years balancing books taught me to watch patterns before correcting them. In the days that followed, I started writing down every demand Rachel made, every last-minute babysitting request, every snide comment about my frugality, every time Daniel borrowed my keys without asking, like a scientist logging data points before an experiment. At night, when the clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, I read articles online about one-party consent laws, deposit holds, and tenant rights, and I filled a folder labeled Plan with printed pages and post-it notes in tidy columns. I also joined a support group at our community center for older adults, navigating boundaries with adult children, a space where my hands could wrap around a paper cup of weak coffee, while my voice shook less each time I told my story. At those meetings, I met Mr. Thompson, a widower with calloused hands and a wry sense of humor, who became the first person outside my family to hear the full outline of my situation. He confided that his own daughter once tried to evict him, and that he learned the hard way that in our state, if someone has lived in a home for at least 1 year, at least 30 days, the landlord or co-owner cannot change the locks without a court order. Doing so is an illegal eviction and a misdemeanor. That knowledge soothed me like balm on a burn, because it meant Rachel and Daniel couldn't simply lock me out, and it strengthened my spine when I walked back into the penthouse each day with my chin a little higher. In quiet moments, I sat with David on the balcony, pointing out pigeons perched on fire escapes and teaching him to count trucks on the avenue below, cherishing his little hand in mine while knowing his parents were counting my dollars upstairs. He would lean his curly head against my shoulder and ask why Mommy and Daddy were always angry, and I'd tell him that grown-ups sometimes forget to use their nice words, promising silently that he would grow up seeing better. As summer drifted into fall, my attorney filed the partition action in court, and when the sheriff's deputy served Rachel and Daniel with the papers at dinner, the silverware clinked, and David asked why a man in a uniform was at the door. Daniel's face flushed crimson as he skimmed the summons, his mouth twisting as he realized I had called his bluff. And Rachel's eyes darted between him and me like a tennis match, confusion and fear flickering in the spaces where entitlement had once been. I remained seated, my fork steady, and calmly told them we would have to work out the sale of the property through the courts because I refused to be bullied or defrauded anymore, and that I wanted what was fair for me and ultimately for David. Daniel's voice rose, calling me ungrateful, accusing me of tearing apart the family, but I stayed quiet because my lawyer had warned me not to argue. The court would handle it, and every outburst on his part would only strengthen my case. Rachel burst into tears and ran to her bedroom, slamming the door so hard the picture frames rattled, and for a moment I almost went after her like I did when she was 5, but I caught myself and remembered Mr. Thompson's words, "They're grown. Let them lie in the bed they made." For the next several months, we lived like boarders in a boarding house, sharing kitchen space but barely speaking, passing each other silently while awaiting court dates, the only sound in the morning being the drip of coffee and the occasional cartoon David watched at low volume. To outsiders, nothing seemed wrong. I still took David to his soccer practice, made cupcakes for his kindergarten class using butter from the supermarket, and accompanied Rachel to her prenatal appointments when she discovered she was expecting again. But inside tension crackled like static. Yes, she was pregnant, and part of me feared that my legal battle would set an example for the new baby about family division. Yet another part of me hoped it would teach them about standing up to injustice, even within bloodlines. In those months, I also realized how isolated I had become, so I started attending a ceramics class at the community center, shaping wet clay into bowls while shaping my boundaries into stronger walls, and I exchanged numbers with a woman named Janet, who offered to teach me to knit. We'd sit on benches in the park sipping coffee from the little cafe at the corner and talk about everything from rising grocery prices at Costco to the ways adult children sometimes forget the hands that wiped their noses. It was in one of those conversations that she mentioned a YouTube channel called Grace's Stories that shares true family dramas, and she said she'd heard a similar situation where a mother reclaimed her home after being tricked, which made me feel less alone and, honestly, motivated me to tell mine. Meanwhile, Daniel tried his own maneuvers. He filed motions to delay the partition, petitioned the court to declare me incompetent, and even threatened to move back to his parents' house in Florida to avoid selling. But each time my attorney filed a response as crisp as a freshly ironed shirt. He also stopped making his portion of the mortgage payments, perhaps to force me into default, but my careful budgeting and the funds I'd moved to Fidelity allowed me to keep the account current and further prove to the judge who was acting in good faith. I'd catch Rachel whispering to him at night on the balcony, their voices rising like seagulls before a storm. And I wondered if she regretted her choices or if she was simply terrified of losing the lifestyle she thought she deserved. For my part, I still loved her deeply, but I had learned that love isn't a blank check, and if she wanted my affection, she had to treat me like a mother, not an ATM. Court hearings dragged on through the fall and winter, and each time we sat on opposite benches under fluorescent lights, the judge would ask questions about occupancy and contributions, and Daniel would bristle when the evidence of the forged signature was introduced. My attorney submitted the recording of Daniel admitting they could make me sign anything. And though he tried to object, the judge reminded him that in New York, only one party needs to consent to a recording, making it admissible and damning. In December, the judge ordered a sale by partition, appointing a neutral referee to oversee the listing and eventual closing, and gave us 90 days to cooperate or risk contempt. On a rainy Thursday in March, we sat around the glass coffee table as the referee explained the final offer and distribution of proceeds, and Daniel seized the moment to argue that I hadn't contributed enough, but the referee silenced him with a shake of her head. When the sale finally closed, my share was enough to purchase a modest bungalow in a quiet neighborhood, and my hands trembled slightly as I signed my portion of the proceeds, knowing there would be a deposit hold, but that once the funds cleared, my path would be clear too. Daniel and Rachel received their share minus the amounts we proved they siphoned through forged checks and wire transfers, and while Daniel stormed out of the closing conference room muttering about injustice, Rachel lingered long enough to whisper, "How could you do this to me?" I looked her in the eye and said softly, "You did this when you forged my name and told me I didn't deserve love." And for the first time since she learned to walk, she had no words. In the weeks that followed, I packed my belongings: photo albums, a quilt my mother made, a jar of beach glass collected over decades, and moved into a one-story house with a small yard where daffodils poked through the earth like hope. I bought new locks and kept a spare key with my neighbor instead of my daughter, and when the bank released the rest of my funds after the hold period, I paid off the mortgage completely, relishing the sensation of being debt-free. I joined a silver sneakers class at the local rec center and learned that I could still touch my toes. That laughter over missed steps with other seniors built community, just as strong as any blood ties. Meanwhile, Daniel's hedge fund faced investigation for misrepresenting returns, and he spent long hours on the phone with his lawyer trying to avoid charges, his stress peaking while mine finally ebbed. Rachel gave birth to a baby girl, Hope, on a cold day in February, and though we were still strained, she called me from the hospital asking if I would come hold my granddaughter because Daniel had been arrested by federal agents earlier that morning. When I walked into the maternity ward, the smell of antiseptic and new life mingled, and seeing Rachel pale and exhausted, I felt my heart soften because motherhood is a language that transcends pride. I took Hope into my arms, her tiny fingers curling around mine, and Rachel whispered, "I'm sorry," tears sliding down her cheeks like raindrops on a window. And though trust takes longer to rebuild than it does to break, I nodded. We talked quietly about boundaries and respect, about how I would always help my grandchildren, but I would no longer fund their lifestyle or allow them to bully me. And she agreed to family counseling with a trained therapist. In therapy, the counselor brought out a talking stick, a simple wooden dowel we had to hold before speaking, and this small ritual slowed our heated exchanges and forced us to listen, a skill I realized none of us had practiced much. Over months, Rachel began to see that her reaction to me setting limits wasn't about loyalty, but about her own fear of scarcity. And Daniel, once cocky, sat humbled, realizing his choices had cost him not only money, but the respect of his son and newborn daughter. Meanwhile, David, now 5, visited my bungalow every weekend, his laughter echoing off the walls as we baked cookies and planted tomato seeds in terracotta pots on the porch. And he'd tell Hope, "Grandma's house is fun," as if it were the simplest truth in the world. At night, I would sit in my rocking chair with my journal, pen moving over paper as I recorded not only the facts of what had happened, but also my feelings. Because storytelling, I realized, is how we knit together the frayed edges of our lives. One entry was dedicated to Grace's stories, thanking that anonymous narrator for inspiring me to speak, and another entry went through my bullet points of bank policies and legal protections, knowledge I plan to share with other seniors at the community center. During one of our center meetings, I stood up and gave a presentation about deposit holds, one-party consent laws, and illegal eviction protections, and the room of gray heads nodded in understanding, some eyes widening in shock at how easily we could be taken advantage of. Mr. Thompson applauded, adding that I had turned pain into power, and I felt a warmth in my chest that no interest rate could quantify or bank statement could reflect. By summer, Daniel had pled guilty to securities fraud and was sentenced to a short stint in federal prison, followed by probation. And while I did not delight in his downfall, I recognized it as the natural consequence of a man who saw rules as speed bumps. Rachel started working part-time at a local library to support her children, learning firsthand the dignity of a paycheck earned by her own hours rather than by someone else's signature. And she began bringing her own coffee in a thermos instead of stopping at expensive cafes. We continued counseling and even had a few sessions with David in the room, teaching him that even grown-ups can make mistakes and apologize. And he asked innocently why adults sometimes forget the rules they set for children. That simple question cut through layers of resentment like a hot knife through butter. And I promised myself to model what accountability looks like by acknowledging that I, too, had allowed fear of being alone to cloud my judgment in giving too much. By Thanksgiving of the following year, we hosted a small meal together at my bungalow, and while the turkey dried out slightly and the stuffing was more boxed than homemade, the conversation felt less brittle than it had in years. After dinner, Rachel handed me a card that said, "Thank you for teaching me how to stand on my own feet." And inside was a note with an offer to start reimbursing me monthly for some of the money she had taken. It wasn't the full amount, but it was a start, and more importantly, it was voluntary. So I accepted with a hug and a whispered reminder that the best repayment would be respect and consistency. The following spring, I found myself standing again at a courthouse, but this time it was to watch Rachel finalize the sale of her and Daniel's new, smaller home that they had purchased without a dime of my money, and I felt pride swell in my chest as she signed her own name. She moved into a modest 2-bedroom and learned to budget using a spreadsheet I helped her set up. A moment so sweetly ironic that I laughed, and she rolled her eyes the way she used to when I corrected her multiplication tables. Our relationship wasn't magically fixed. There were still days when old patterns crept up like ivy, and I had to remind her gently that I am her mother, not her personal assistant. But we had a framework now built from boundaries and balanced ledgers. As for David and Hope, they thrived, unburdened by the legal mess their parents had created. They rode bikes in my cul-de-sac, their laughter like birdsong, and they spent lazy summer afternoons reading picture books on my porch swing. That letter I handed the doorman on Mother's Day, the one Rachel couldn't finish reading, outlined the partition action and my refusal to be manipulated anymore. It also contained a line I meant with my whole heart. I will always love you, but love cannot be bought or extorted. A sentence that took me 68 years to learn to write. There was poetic justice in the fact that the very letter that signaled my withdrawal of financial support also invited her, eventually, back into relationship on new terms, because boundaries aren't walls forever. They are gates with locks and keys. As I sit here now, pen scraping against paper, I realize that my greatest revenge wasn't selling the penthouse or exposing Daniel's fraud. It was reclaiming my self-respect and teaching the people who thought they owned me that I am not a line item on their balance sheet. If you're listening and find yourself in a similar situation, know that quiet strength and knowledge of your rights can be more powerful than shouting, and that there are communities, like the people at Grace's Stories or a support group at your local rec center, waiting to lift you up. One last note about that deposit hold. The day the funds from the penthouse sale cleared, I bought myself a bouquet of fresh tulips from the grocery store and sat at my kitchen table watching the petals open, a visual reminder that growth happens in its own time. In the end, revenge is simply a story of consequences set to the rhythm of justice, and mine hummed a tune that I can dance to now with my grandchildren under twinkling string lights. A song of independence and reclaimed joy. Thank you for listening to my story. Tell me where you're listening from and what boundaries you've learned to draw, because our shared experiences are the threads that weave a stronger community. Before Daniel ever entered our orbit, Rachel and I lived in a cramped 2-bedroom in Queens, where the wallpaper peeled and the radiator hissed like an angry cat. Yet we were happy because we had each other and a slow cooker full of stew. I remember evenings spent at the dining table with a stack of bills and a calculator, teaching Rachel how to add columns while the smell of chicken roasting filled the apartment and the sound of the 6 o'clock news murmured in the background. Those lessons in arithmetic were my way of preparing her for the world, yet somewhere along the way she stopped adding her own contributions and began subtracting from my trust. When her father was alive, he drove a beat-up Honda Accord, the same car he taught Rachel to parallel park with me cheering from the sidewalk, and he always said, "A car is a tool, not a trophy," advice Rachel forgot after meeting Daniel. After his heart attack, we sold that car for scrap and used the money to pay for Rachel's college textbooks, each page of knowledge funded by the miles we'd driven to Little League games and grocery stores. In her dorm room at college, I hung a bulletin board with encouraging notes. And at orientation, I told her gently not to let anyone make her feel less than. Advice that must have slipped between the cracks of her memory when Daniel whispered sweet promises in her ear. I also remember the first time she lied to me. She said she needed $300 for a lab fee but bought a leather jacket instead. And I found out when a receipt fell from her pocket, the ink still crisp. I forgave her quickly but made a mental note. Forgiveness does not equal forgetfulness, and the seeds of entitlement sprout in fertile soil when watered with unearned yeses. A lesson I learned too late, but one I now teach to any parent who will listen. After she graduated and landed a job as an assistant at a marketing firm, she called me from her first business trip, complaining about her economy seat and asking if I could upgrade her using my credit card. Her voice was breezy, but my heart sank. I sent her $200 because I wanted to make her comfortable, even though it meant skipping my own dentist appointment that month. And Daniel, whom she had just started dating, thanked me with a text that read, the best," as if gratitude were an emoji. Looking back, those small asks were test balloons to see how much I would give. And each time I said yes, my boundary retreated an inch like a shoreline under a relentless tide. When Rachel and Daniel announced their engagement at a backyard barbecue, he shook my hand firmly and looked me in the eye, promising to take care of my daughter. I believed him then, and the memory stings like a paper cut now. At their wedding, Daniel's parents, all smiles and pearls, pulled me aside and thanked me for raising such a wonderful woman, but their eyes flicked across the venue as if calculating the value of the floral arrangements. Their gift to the couple was a down payment on a small condominium, and mine was my grandmother's wedding ring, a simple band of gold that had survived immigration and poverty. Rachel cried and promised she'd cherish it always. 2 months later, she asked if she could trade that ring in for something more modern because Daniel preferred platinum, and my chest tightened even as I smiled and told her no, explaining that some heirlooms are non-negotiable because love is not measured in carats. She sulked but accepted, and for a while I thought that was the end of it. Until years later, when I discovered Daniel had taken the ring to a jeweler without telling me, melted it down, and used part of the proceeds to buy himself a fancy watch. When I confronted Rachel, she insisted that a watch was practical because Daniel needed to look successful with clients. The twisted logic made my jaw clench, but I let it go for peace, a choice that gnawed at me whenever I glanced at my bare finger. It is easy to lose yourself in a series of compromises, and I did so gradually, like a frog in a pot of water that warms too slowly to notice until it boils, until one day the water spilled over the edge. During the early years of David's life, I felt both grateful and resentful. Grateful to witness his first steps, resentful that his parents saw my time as theirs to allocate, and the guilt of feeling resentful kept me quiet. One afternoon when David was 2, I arrived to babysit and found Daniel sitting at the kitchen counter, scrolling through his phone while their bank statement lay open, numbers circled. He looked up and asked if I could transfer $5,000 to cover a temporary overdraft before the account hit a negative fee. Without thinking, I did, because avoiding his frustration had become my reflex. But later that night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the glow of the alarm clock numerals casting shadows, and I realized my compliance was costing me more than money. These little indignities formed the backdrop to the Mother's Day message that would later break me, and without understanding this accumulation, you cannot understand why my response, silence and a carefully folded letter, was the only way to heal. Returning to the present after the sale, I set about building a new life, not only physically but emotionally, filling my days with activities that had nothing to do with Rachel and Daniel and everything to do with Sandra. I learned to make bread from scratch, kneading dough with hands once cramped from typing spreadsheets, delighting when the yeast rose. I took long walks through the neighborhood, inhaling the scent of fresh mulch and cut grass. I volunteered at a local food pantry, organizing cans and chatting with other volunteers about recipes and grandchildren, and found satisfaction in knowing my time was helping people who asked with humility rather than entitlement. One evening, I attended a budgeting workshop at a nonprofit where a young woman from a credit union explained deposit hold policies again, but also talked about predatory loans and ways seniors can protect themselves. When she asked if anyone had experience with unexpected holds or fraud, I raised my hand and shared my story, and the room grew quiet as my voice filled the air, equal parts trembling and firm, my experience no longer a secret shame, but a teaching tool. After the workshop, a man named Gerald approached me and said his son had recently pressured him to co-sign on a car loan, and he wasn't sure what to do. We sat on folding chairs and I told him what I had learned about boundaries, legal options, and trust. In helping others, I found a sense of purpose I thought I'd lost when my job ended, and my identity was swallowed by my role as a grandmother. Activism, it turned out, can be as simple as sharing your story at the right time. Another storyline in this long tale involves my neighbor, Mrs. Patel, who lived across the hall in the new bungalow community and who invited me over for chai and gossip after she saw me struggling to carry groceries from Costco up the driveway. Her daughter had moved her in from another state and visited once a month, always complaining about the inconvenience, and Mrs. Patel confided that she often felt like a burden. Together, we started a weekly potluck where neighbors shared dishes and stories, building a support network that had nothing to do with blood. At one potluck, we played cards and laughed until our sides hurt, and I caught myself thinking that family can be chosen as well as born, that sometimes the people who appreciate you most are the ones who've endured similar disappointments. Around this time, Rachel and Daniel's legal trouble spilled into the news. Local headlines described the hedge fund scandal in crisp fonts, and I couldn't avoid reading about it even when I tried, because neighbors would ask if that was my son-in-law. When asked, I simply said that choices have consequences, and that I hoped everyone involved would learn something. A response that drew nods from those who knew there was more to the story, and from those who secretly wanted me to revel in his downfall. The truth is, revenge fantasies might give a momentary thrill, but living well with integrity provides a satisfaction far deeper than watching someone else stumble. At my age, energy is precious, and bitterness is heavy to carry. Still, I won't pretend I didn't feel a small sense of vindication when I heard that Daniel's former colleagues distanced themselves and that he would be banned from working in securities again. Natural consequences to hubris and deceit. As the months rolled on, Rachel grew into a mother of 2 with a humility I hadn't seen before, her tone softer and her demands fewer. She'd call me asking for advice on how to make a dollar stretch at the grocery store or how to calm a colicky infant, and I'd answer while mixing flour or watering plants, offering help from a place of generosity rather than obligation. At one point, she even admitted, "I used to think money fixed everything, but you were right. It's not money but time and honesty that make a home." And hearing those words felt like watching the sunrise after a long storm. David started kindergarten and sometimes had to write about his family. When he brought home a drawing of me with gray hair and a cape labeled Super Grandma, I laughed until my sides hurt and hung it on my refrigerator like a prized painting. In his depiction, Daniel was in the background holding a broom, and Rachel held a calculator, images that showed how children absorb everything, including the way we assign roles within the home. I took that drawing to therapy and used it to start a discussion about gender roles and family expectations, a session that ended with all of us promising to reassign chores and responsibilities more equitably. One Saturday, I invited Rachel and the kids over to help me plant a small vegetable garden. We dug holes, our fingernails caked with dirt, and I explained how seeds need space and water to grow, an obvious metaphor that made Rachel look up and smile sheepishly. We had open conversations about boundaries while kneeling in the soil, and for the first time in years, our words didn't feel weaponized. Instead, they felt like trowels turning over earth to make room for something new. Later, while making lemonade in my kitchen, I told Rachel about my neighbor's daughter using access to grandchildren as leverage, and how I vowed never to do that to her. She nodded, understanding perhaps for the first time that my actions came from love and self-respect, not spite. One evening, long after the court battles were over, Rachel and I sat on my porch swing listening to crickets and the distant hum of traffic, and she asked me when I first knew Daniel was trouble. I told her about the day I discovered the forged signature and how my stomach dropped. She closed her eyes and said she wished I had told her sooner, and I responded that sometimes mothers protect their children from pain, but that this time, letting her feel the full weight of her actions was the protection she needed. In therapy, we talked about generational cycles, how her sense of entitlement might have mirrored my own mother's tendency to overgive, and how we both had the power to break those patterns for David and Hope. Breaking patterns is messy and uncomfortable, like stretching muscles you haven't used in years, but the soreness that follows is proof of growth and the promise of strength. I also had to reconcile with my guilt for not setting boundaries sooner, and I found solace in writing letters to my younger self, telling that overworked laundromat employee to stand firm sooner and to believe she deserved kindness too. Those letters remained in a shoebox in my closet. Maybe one day Rachel will read them and understand the full arc of my life, but for now they are reminders that our stories matter even when we think no one is listening. Not all my days were heavy introspection. Some were light and filled with the smell of cinnamon rolls baking and the laughter of friends playing dominoes at my kitchen table. The sort of simple joy that doesn't make headlines, but fills a heart. I discovered a passion for painting at a community art class. My brushstrokes tentative at first, then bold, colors blending into landscapes that mirrored the upstate hills I'd visited as a child. Mr. Thompson joined me once and painted a courthouse with bright yellow doors. When I asked why, he said justice should be welcoming and open, a sentiment that made me smile and file away for future contemplation. On rainy afternoons, I'd pick up my knitting needles and work on a scarf for Hope, each stitch an act of patience, each row a meditation on how slow progress often produces something warm and enduring. When I delivered the finished scarf to Rachel, she hugged me and said, "You always make things better." And I gently reminded her that knitting requires time and focus, the same qualities we were applying to our relationship. Our interactions with David also changed. Instead of me always saying yes, I started giving him small choices, carrots or celery for a snack, the blue shirt or the green, teaching him that autonomy comes with responsibility. Rachel observed this and began implementing choices at home, Later, she told me that giving David options reduced tantrums and increased cooperation, a small victory that built her confidence as a parent without leaning on me for constant guidance. At one session, she admitted she had equated success with material possessions because of the culture she worked in, and because she thought providing her children with everything would erase her own childhood insecurities, an insight that resonated with many. Her vulnerability softened the room, and one man in his 30s broke down, confessing that he constantly pressured his mother for money because he feared appearing poor to his friends. Watching their exchange felt like seeing the cycle break. Over time, our support group evolved from a space of venting to one of learning, with guest speakers like social workers, attorneys, and even a bank manager, and we created a resource list to share widely. We held a community fair at the rec center where we offered pamphlets on tenant rights, deposit holds, one-party consent laws, and budgeting. I manned the table with a smile and a bowl of candies. A young woman approached, scanning the materials, and whispered that her brother was threatening to take their father's house. I handed her a sheet on protective orders and encouraged her to seek legal advice, my heart pounding with empathy. Later, she emailed me saying the information helped them stop the transfer and that her father thanked her for standing up to her brother. Sometimes sharing your story changes not just your life, but ripples outward to others. I also took a fraud prevention class at the library where we learned to spot phishing emails and scam phone calls. I practiced by hanging up on suspicious callers, a small exercise in saying no to strangers, just as I had learned to say no to family. During tax season, I hired a certified public accountant to review my filings, a first for me, and she pointed out deductions I'd missed and reminded me to track charitable contributions. Investing in expertise saved me money and stress. Inspired by this, Rachel began working with a financial counselor to pay down her debt and build an emergency fund, and she updated me with her progress, not to ask for help, but to share accountability. In one counseling session, she confessed to overspending at a department store and immediately cutting up the card. A story I might have once rolled my eyes at, but now applauded as growth, because awareness is the first step. Daniel, for his part, started volunteering at a local soup kitchen during his probation. And though it began as court-mandated, he later told me he kept going because the work grounded him and reminded him of what matters. When we talk about values now, our conversations circle back to service, honesty, and respect. Money is part of life, but it no longer dominates the agenda the way it once did when penthouse views mattered more than porch swings. At one family meeting, we even joked about our past mistakes. Rachel teased me about hoarding grocery receipts, and I teased Daniel about his new trade manual. The ability to laugh at ourselves indicated deep healing. Still, we never forget the lessons. We keep a whiteboard on my fridge listing upcoming bills, events, and who is responsible. A visual reminder that communication prevents misunderstandings and that shared information can avert future conflicts. On a leisurely Sunday, Rachel stumbled across an old family photo album in my closet, and we spent hours flipping through pages, laughing at hairstyles and remembering relatives. Those photos anchored us in shared history beyond the past few years of conflict. We found a picture of my mother standing in front of her farmhouse, smiling despite the hardships she endured, and Rachel whispered, "She would be proud of you." Words that felt like a benediction and tied 3 generations together. That moment made me realize our story is part of a lineage of women who fought for their dignity in quiet ways. Through letters, through recipes saved, through property deeds kept safe in drawers, and through boundaries set at kitchen tables. Knowing this lineage gives me strength to continue speaking up and to encourage younger women like Rachel to do the same, not as rebellion but as self-respect, a lesson that changes families. We also make space for grief. I still miss my husband and sometimes wonder how he would have handled Daniel. And Rachel mourns the relationship she thought she had with her father-in-law before the arrest, acknowledging loss without dwelling in it. On the anniversary of my husband's death, we visited his grave together with the kids, placing flowers and telling stories, weaving past and present into a tapestry of memory and lesson, and it felt like closure and connection. David asked if Grandpa would be mad at Mommy and Daddy, and I told him that Grandpa would want everyone to learn and do better. Forgiveness, I said, is love's repair kit, used to fix broken things carefully. Teaching children about complex emotions with simple metaphors sometimes teaches adults too, and we all left the cemetery feeling lighter, carrying forward lessons instead of weight. Later that evening, we baked my husband's favorite peanut butter cookies and danced to his favorite Motown records, honoring him through joy as much as through tears, because grief and celebration can coexist. These rituals, cooking, visiting graves, sharing stories, became anchors that grounded us amid the ongoing work of maintaining healthy relationships, showing that healing is sustained by both actions and traditions. When I look at David and Hope, I see the chance to break cycles entirely. They can grow up understanding boundaries from the start, which might spare them the pain we endured, and that prospect fills me with hope. One evening, Hope toddled toward the street, and Rachel gently but firmly picked her up, saying, "We have to stay in the yard." And then she looked at me and smiled, both of us recognizing boundary setting in action. Moments like that, simple but profound, reassure me that the lessons took root and that the next generation will have healthier patterns than the last, making our struggles worthwhile. At times, I still catch myself wanting to jump in and rescue Rachel when she struggles. But I stop and remind myself that allowing her to experience discomfort is part of her growth. Rescue without learning breeds dependence. I am still learning this dance of when to step forward and when to step back. And as long as I keep reflecting and adjusting, I know the dance will stay graceful, even if my feet occasionally misstep. Our story has also inspired Rachel to talk to her friends about financial transparency with their parents, and she has helped a colleague set up a monthly budget, something she once balked at herself, proving that lessons learned can be paid forward. Daniel, meanwhile, has become something of a cautionary speaker at his new job's orientation, sharing his story of greed and fraud with incoming employees. He told me it feels like penance and purpose, and I believe him. Hearing him own his mistakes publicly didn't erase my anger entirely, but it did soften it, because accountability spoken aloud matters more than silent shame, and it allows those hurt to begin to forgive. On one of our last therapy sessions, the counselor asked us to reflect on what we would tell our younger selves. I said, "Trust your gut and set limits sooner." Rachel said, "Listen to Mom." And Daniel said, "Greed isn't worth it." And we laughed through tears. That exercise proved cathartic, giving us a chance to speak directly to our past selves and to each other about regrets and wisdom, creating closure and direction we can carry forward. After therapy ended, we committed to monthly family meetings without a professional, using the talking stick ritual to keep us on track. Our first unsupervised session went smoothly, with check-ins, appreciations, and plans for the next month. These meetings are now something we look forward to rather than dread, and they help us course correct before resentment builds. A preventive measure rather than a crisis response, like regular oil changes for a car. In between meetings, we all slip occasionally. Old patterns resurface, but we catch them quicker and apologize sooner, turning missteps into opportunities for reconnection instead of letting them fester. My friends at the support group remind me to celebrate these small wins, and we exchange stories of boundaries held and apologies received, cheering each other on like a team of long-distance runners. By building a network of women supporting each other, we've turned what could have been isolated tragedies into a movement for elder justice in our neighborhood, advocating for better policies and respect. We petitioned the county to host more seminars on financial exploitation, and our letters, filled with personal stories, were instrumental in securing funding. Our voices, once timid, are now loud enough to reach the county commissioners. Seeing a flyer in the library for one of those seminars with my photo on it made me chuckle and blush, but I attended anyway and answered questions, proud to be a resource and a recognizable face for others. Every time someone comes up to me afterward and says, "Your story gave me courage," I feel the circle complete, from the day I sat alone reading a deposit hold to now standing on stages, empowering others. My grandchildren think it's funny that strangers know me from the internet, and David once asked if I'm famous. I told him I'm famous for loving him and standing up for myself, and that's the only fame I need. Hope clapped her hands and said she wants to be brave like Grandma, and Rachel smiled knowingly, proud that her daughter has a different role model than she once did, and my eyes filled with tears. On rainy days when I'm tempted to revisit old hurts, I remind myself to look forward, to plan my next knitting project, and to savor the freedom of a life reclaimed, because the future holds more promise than the past. Recently, I taught David how to balance a checkbook, a skill I fear is disappearing in the digital age. He was fascinated by the idea of tracking each transaction, and I smiled, knowing the lesson was about more than math. We sat at my kitchen table, pencils in hand, and he asked why the numbers mattered. I told him that understanding your money means understanding your power, and he nodded solemnly as if receiving a secret code. Teaching him that skill felt like closing a loop, giving the next generation the tools to protect themselves so that maybe they won't need revenge stories of their own one day, just stories of wisdom handed down. In preparation for this script, I rehearsed telling my story in my head dozens of times, trimming unnecessary parts and emphasizing the lessons, because I wanted every word to count and every listener to feel seen. If you're still listening, know that your attention is a form of respect, and I don't take it lightly. Stories shared become part of the listener's wisdom too, and you now carry a piece of mine. To anyone tempted to dismiss an older woman's warnings as nagging or paranoia, remember that experience is often a shield forged in fire, and ignoring it can burn you, sometimes literally in a bank account. I realize not every mother will get the apology I did, and not every child will change. But that doesn't mean setting boundaries is futile. It means your peace may come from distance, not reunion, and that's still valuable. In some ways, my story is mundane, no car chases or secret spy gadgets, but that's what makes it relatable. Betrayals often happen at kitchen tables and in text messages, not on the big screen, and the heroes are everyday women. Thank you for taking the time to listen to an everyday woman reclaim her narrative. May your own narrative be filled with dignity, justice, and perhaps a porch swing or two to remind you to pause. As I finally set down my pen, I can hear the faint sound of David's laughter through an open window, and I smile because that sound is the only applause I'll ever need, more rewarding than any legal victory. Good night, dear listener. May your boundaries be firm, your love be kind, and your coffee always warm, because comfort and courage make a perfect pair. I'll see you in the comments section. Tell me your story, and together we'll continue to build a community where seniors feel heard and valued, and where younger listeners learn to respect the elders in their lives. Until then, keep your head high, your bank statements close, and your heart open, because vigilance and compassion are not mutually exclusive. This is Sandra signing off with love and a quiet smile, grateful for the chance to turn pain into power, and for the ears that made the transformation worthwhile. May the lessons of my journey echo in your choices, and may the open loops of your life close with justice and compassion, leaving space for new beginnings. Remember to share this video with someone who needs the courage to set boundaries, because sometimes we all need a friend to hand us a metaphorical talking stick and remind us to speak. And as Grace's stories taught me, hearing one person's tale can light a path for another. May my path illuminate yours a little, and may you feel less alone. If you have questions about the laws or resources I mentioned, feel free to ask in the comments, and I'll do my best to point you in the right direction. Because knowledge shared is power multiplied. Please also let me know where you're listening from. whether it's New York like me or somewhere far away, so we can see how far this circle of support reaches and build a map of connection. As you go about your day, remember that even if your story is still messy, you are in the middle, not the end. And there is power in turning pages, especially when you hold the pen. Good night again, and thank you. Your presence here means my hard-won wisdom doesn't stop with me, and that thought fills me with peace. Don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe if you found value in this story, because that support helps Grace's stories reach more people who might need to hear it and encourages me to keep sharing. Now, I'll truly sign off, grateful for your time, and leave you with this. Boundaries are the invisible lines that make love visible, drawing a clear picture of respect for all involved.